In the last video, I discussed the potential archaeological findings and the absence of findings on these sites relevant for our dilemma, with the main conclusion that if the conventional opinion is right, so with the Fortress Antonia located here, then that this area here on the north side of the Temple Mount was already a temple square prior to the Hasmonean kings, because King Hyrcanus I built a citadel on the Antonia site adjoining the temple, which Herod later turned into Fortress Antonia, allegedly. So a large pre-Hasmonean structure is therefore to be found at the northern side of the Temple Mount. While, on the other hand, if this structure here is Antonia, then an Hasmonean remnants must be hiding here in the southwest quarter of the Temple Mount. Now, I promised in that video to come back on the actual findings on and around these three sites, and I will, but in this video I will address the constraints set by the Bible for the location of the temple. Now, I've heard several kind of reasonings used to defend the Dome of the Rock site to be the temple location, according to the Bible, following reasonings like it has to be on top of Mount Moria, or the alternative location is not on Mount Moria but on Mount Zion, and so on. Now, as far as I know, there are 4 location identifiers to be found in the Bible, and the first 3 of them are found in 2 Chronicles chapter 3, and those 3 criterions are 1 in Jerusalem, 2 on Mount Moriah, and 3 on the threshing floor of Arona. And according 1 Kings chapter 8, the first 4 verses, we can derive one criterion, and that is the following. What is being said over there? The priest moved the Ark of the Covenant out of the city of David up to the temple, which strongly suggested that they brought it to a more elevated position in comparison to the city where David had brought his ark to. Now, let me introduce you to this map here. There is a map with elevation lines, and this is a site for Jerusalem. I can show you that over here, where we see Jerusalem now projected on that map. Here we see the Temple Mount with the temple, the palace of King Herod here, and here the pool of Siloam. Now, the first criterion in Jerusalem seems simple, but be aware, did the authors meant that the temple was within the boundaries of Jerusalem at the time of King Solomon? Because in that case, one can doubt whether the current Dome of the Rock site, so this site here, qualifies for this criterion, because this used to be the old city David took, and it was probably extended in the course of some years under the leadership of Joab, as we can read in the Bible, but there is a likelihood that it has been across the Tyropoeon Valley towards part of Jerusalem that later became the upper city. So the conventional site, located 400 meters north of the city of David, or the city David took over, may very well be outside of the boundaries of Jerusalem. In the 37 years from the moment David took over the city till the moment Solomon started the building of Jerusalem, starting the building of the temple, Jerusalem did expand, but how far and in which direction? However, it could also be the case that the authors of Chronicles identified the site to be in Jerusalem, as Jerusalem was at the time of the authors. That is something you see more than once in the Old Testament, that a location was identified by the name it had in the time when the book was written, not necessarily the name it had back in the days. And if that is the case, then the conventional location for the temple qualifies for this constraint. It is in Jerusalem. Now the second criterion, on Mount Moriah, for us this location isn't very well defined. Based on the book of Genesis, where the mount is mentioned before, we can say that this mount is 3 days walking from Beersheba. So probably somewhere in the mountains of Judea, but that is not very specific. Now, with the revelation that the temple was built on Mount Moriah, we now know that this here is Mount Moriah. This geological feature. Now, it is good to discuss here how Zion, or Mount Zion, or mountains of Zion relates to Mount Moriah. Some people seem to think that those names are mutual, excluding locations, but that is not true. If you read the Psalms, which often refer to Zion, it is very clear that Zion equates with Jerusalem. For example, Psalm 51, verse 18, we read, "Do good in thy good pleasure unto Zion, buildest thou the walls of Jerusalem." Zion and Jerusalem aren't two different things here. The second sentence just repeats the idea of the first sentence, and that is something which is done quite often in Hebrew poetry. Here we see the same idea in Isaiah chapter 4, verse 3. Also, what is said there? And it shall come to pass that he that is left in Zion and he that remaineth in Jerusalem shall be called holy. So here again, a repetition in the second sentence of the idea of the first sentence. Now notice the difference in prepositions as well. It is in Zion and on Mount Moriah, and that difference exists not only in English but also in Hebrew. Now going back to the site, the difference between Moriah and Zion is that the first is a geological feature, this mountain, and Zion is a geographical feature, namely the city with the temple in it. And of course that city has become larger over time, and therefore in Psalm 133 it is possible to speak about the mountains of Zion, plural. Here, and as the dew that descends upon the mountains of Zion, plural. The mountains on which Jerusalem resides, and in the course of time that became more than one mountain. So, going back to this picture here, This here is Mount Moria, geological feature, not in competition with Zion, and separate from the Tyropian Valley and the Kidron Valley and the Gihon Valley, and probably also separated from the mountain on the other side of the Tyropian Valley. Now the fourth constraint is the strong suggestion that the Ark of the Covenant was carried upward out of the city of David. David had brought the Ark to the city not long after he took the city, so the Ark was probably in this location here. And the phrase from 1 Kings chapter 8 indicates that it was brought up out of the city, and when it's going up, then he must have gone along this line, along this ridge, up to this location here. There ends the upward movement, because that then we have reached the top. That doesn't say it ended there, but this is the line where the Temple of Solomon was located. So we haven't pinpointed it yet. It's still a curve, and in order to pinpoint it, there is a third constraint, namely that it has to be on the threshing floor of Aurona. Now, unfortunately, this detail is lost in time, where the threshing floor of Aurona exactly was, but notice that it didn't say on top. That would have pinpointed this location, but it was on the threshing floor. In other words, with our current knowledge of the details, or the lack thereof, the Bible doesn't differentiate between those two sides. This side here, or the alternative side being here. Both are possible. Now you can have an opinion about the boundaries of Jerusalem at that time, or boundaries of Mount Moria for that matter, but every conclusion based on that opinion doesn't carry the weight of a biblical necessity, so to speak. It's more the consequence of your own opinion than something what the Bible said. Anyway, the temple can be anywhere here along this line, according the Bible verses, but that doesn't mean that the Bible doesn't give us a clue. It does, namely the threshing floor. Here we see a threshing floor, an ancient threshing floor, and the one from Aurona was probably something like this, an area of with a diameter of 5, maybe 10 meters, with a solid floor, about horizontal. But as you can see here, it can be built on a slope as well, quite easily. The only relevant criterion was there must be a little bit of wind blowing. Now, that is an easy criterion, because if we consider this threshing floor here, somewhere along this line, it is always close to the ridge, so chances are that some wind was blowing, especially in the afternoon at the end of the summer. And considering the slope of this ridge, there were surely multiple spots about horizontal with a diameter of a few meters. So in principle, this threshing floor could have been anywhere here. But the fact that the threshing floor could have been everywhere brings us to the question, which spot was selected by Araunah the Jebusite, or his grandfather, or whoever selected the spot for this threshing floor. Where did he build his threshing floor? And logistics must have been an important consideration. The main market for the threshed corn was here in the city, called Jebus at the time, and it is so that was where his market was, and it is safe to say that his suppliers were also not that far away, because the raw material wasn't brought by truck from the valley of Jericho, that is for sure. They had to carry it on their back, on their own back, or by means of donkeys. So we can assume that the supply lines were relatively short in those days. And we can draw those here. For instance, let me draw possible sites for places where people had a field to have their corn not far from their main market. But then they have to bring it firstly to the threshing floor. Now let me position first the threshing floor on the location, on the alternative location, and see what will happen when we are going to bring our corn to the threshing floor, thresh our corn and bring it to the city. Or here and then there. While on the other hand, if the other side is the threshing floor, then we have supply lines like this, that we first have to bring it over there and then to thresh it and then to bring it to the city. And that makes a thing very clear, that if you have your threshing floor up at the top, that the total lines, the logistical lines, are substantially longer. Roughly about 500 meters, you added roughly 500 meters to your logistical lines and 40 meters additional elevation in elevation. So the difference is 300 meters further and 40 meters higher. So in terms of labor productivity, a threshing floor on the top of Mount Moria is way less efficient than the alternative location. And with laziness being a very common trait in humanity, most of the time people were looking for ways to make their life more easy, makes us think that the biblical information about the threshing floor hints more towards the alternative location than on a location on the top. And a parallel kind of reasoning exists about the role of the Gihon spring. Living water plays an important role in the temple, explicitly for the purification involved, for the involved priest and Levites, but the large copper structure which contains a lot of water in front of the temple, close to the altar, well, that water must have been refreshed frequently, if not continuously. So there is reason to believe that Solomon already implemented some kind of aqueduct to have the required water delivered. But with the water being that important, it's likely that the vicinity of the Gihon spring was part of the consideration. Murphy might not have been born back in those days, but the idea that things can go wrong did already exist, I can tell you. The Gihon spring must have been part of the backup plan. And transporting the water these additional 300 meters further up and 40 meters higher, well, that is not an insignificant difference. So also this consideration hints more to this alternative location than to the location on the Temple Mount? Well, it's already a long video, so in a future video I will discuss the rest of what the Bible has to say and the possible consequences of the prophecy of Jesus about the destruction of the temple. Thank you for listening.